Welcome to this tutorial where I'm going to be explaining how I created this basic graph animation which consists of two axes and an arrow with a constant rate of change. And this is actually part of a larger project that I've been working on for a client, and the purpose of it is to demonstrate the health implications of not using renewable energy and the importance of using cleaner alternatives like heat pumps. So I incorporated this graph at one point to visually show a statistic, and I think it's a much more effective way to explain something instead of just using traditional text. So I thought that I'd share how I created this because it can be used in a variety of different contexts if you swap out the text. And the great thing about this is that it's only created out of two solids, a few masks, and text layers. I'm going to assume that you're proficient with After Effects and the user interface, but if not, that's fine. If you're willing to follow directions, then just pause the video a few times and you should be able to recreate this. So the first step is creating a white solid, which we'll use to construct our two axes. Before we start masking though, turn on the proportional grid, which will help us keep our lines straight and attempt to align everything properly within the frame. Then go up to the toolbar and hold down Option to go through your mask presets and select the rectangle tool and draw two rectangular masks that resemble a 90-degree angle. I'd recommend making them longer than they have to be, since we'll be using another mask later on which will give us flexibility regarding their lengths. The width of the lines is totally up to your preference, and make sure to zoom in, especially on the area where they intersect, and make any necessary adjustments. Next up, let's create the arrow. Create another white solid, then hit T to bring up the opacity parameter, and turn that down to 50 so we can see what we're doing. Use the pen tool to draw a rough outline of our arrow in its finished position. You can copy the look I'm using here, or create your own design. When it looks good, turn the opacity back up to 100. Now let's add the text to both axes. For the sake of simplicity, let's just use growth over time. So create a new text layer and pick a font that you feel is appropriate. You can either have the text on the y-axis oriented normally, or you can rotate it 270 degrees, which is common with graphs like this. If you have more than one word, however, then it might be better to keep it flat so that it's easier to read. Then create a second text layer and place it on the x-axis. Now it's time to start animating. I like to animate in reverse, meaning that we already have everything built where we want it to end up, and we're going to be going back in time and animating everything out of frame. So disable every layer except your axes, and use the rectangle tool to draw a mask on top of your two existing rectangles. It won't look quite right at first, so go down to your mask parameters and change the new mask from Add to Intersect. Now this mask will act as a curtain, so we can keyframe this to reveal what is inside of it. Next, go to around half a second or 15 frames in, assuming that you're using a 30 frames per second composition, and move the mask to where we want it to end up. Hit the stopwatch next to the mask path, then move back to 0 seconds, and move the entire mask down to the left until the corner touches the angle where the two axes intersect. And try your best to maintain a perfect rectangle, so keep the left and right sides perpendicular to the x-axis and vice versa. At this point, nothing should be visible. And now when played back, you can see that our mask reveals our two axes. You can always change the speed by moving the keyframes closer or farther apart from one another. Then select both of the keyframes, right-click, and select Easy Ease. This will add ramps to the start and end of your movement, which will create a much more natural-looking animation. Now enable the arrow layer and go up to the Pan Behind tool. Select the anchor point and move it down to the left corner where it will grow from. This is the point where your layer revolves around and will help us when adding position keyframes. Press P, which will bring up the position keyframe, and hit the stopwatch. Then move back in time, preferably to when the axis motion is complete, and move the arrow downwards. You'll notice this red line, which is our mask path. Think of this as the trajectory of our arrow. Then play it back and make changes to the speed if you need to, and add easing like we did with the previous keyframes. Next, we need to create a mask that will isolate the arrow so it's only seen inside the graph. We can do this by creating another rectangle mask and keyframing the mask path to remain in that area. You might have to go frame by frame, but it will end up accomplishing what we need to. Looks great. The same principles will be applied to the text layers. Hit the stopwatch for position, move back in time a few frames, and push the text to the right. And always add easing prior to masking, as this will change the speed and location of your mask. Then create another rectangle mask and keyframe it so it's only visible outside the graph, just like we did with the arrow. and then repeat the process for the text on the x-axis. The only difference is that the movement will be vertical. Then go in and adjust the keyframes so that they make sense in relation to one another. This will take some finessing, but it's critical to the animation looking intentional and professional. Then you can add a background solid to be whatever color you want, and one final touch to make everything pop, and this is optional, but I'll usually duplicate every layer, turn it black, place it behind the original layer, then offset it slightly to add a very subtle drop shadow. This gives it some added dimension. And there we go. You've just created your very own custom graph animation that you can use to add a ton of value to your videos. I hope this was helpful, and good luck with your animations.